Welcome to this week's episode of Insights. During this week's show, we're going to be entirely focused on the crisis in the Berdzor corridor. Essentially, what is the background that brought us to this moment, and who is exactly responsible for this state of affairs. Let's go to a bit of the background, because I don't think people have a clear understanding of where this comes from. One of the points of the November 9th ceasefire agreement was that the area of Berdzor, which was the exact connecting route between Armenia and Artsakh, was going to be handed over to the Aliyev regime 3 years after signing of the agreement. Once a bypass road has been built. A bypass road would be a road that does not go through Shushi, that goes north directly to Stepanakert. And in this process, once this process is done, the city of Berdzor, where Armenians are living in, and the two villages, Aghavno and Nerkin would be handed over to the Aliyev regime. Prior to any such agreements being announced, the Aliyev regime started a very frantic construction project. In fact, they were working night and day to build this access road, byway road, from Stepanakert all the way to the Armenian border. And as soon as they finished this road, they immediately demanded the handover of the Berdzor corridor to themselves. Obviously, the way they enforced this is by immediately starting the aggressions that they did last week against Artsakh, which led to an agreement between Russia, the Aliyev regime, and the Artsakh Republic to finish handing over the Berdzor corridor by the end of this month. Obviously, all of this leads to a lot of questions. First of all, if there was no agreement on building this road, why was it that the other side was frantically building it, working overnight to finish the road as quickly as possible, which means one of two things. One, that there actually was some kind of a verbal agreement on the route and the road and the speed that this was going at. Or secondly, this was something that was simply imposed on us by the other side without us having any say in it. The problems that are forced by this very quick timeline in this handover are actually immense, and most of them are frankly the fault of the Armenian Artsakh governments. First and foremost, no one should be surprised that the other side is not acting in good faith, and it's actually acting like what it is, which is a gangster state trying to cause as many disruptions as possible. This is something that both of these states, Armenia and Artsakh, should have expected. Secondly, the most immediate pressing problem is that there's a part of this road, which is 8 kilometers, which is within Armenia proper, that has not been built because we were expecting this road to be finished a year or a year and a half from now. Obviously, this is something that needs to be done and dealt with immediately, so no access is cut off to Artsakh once this handover happens. Thirdly, and this is most critical, the entire infrastructure, as far as electricity lines, part of the gas lines, and internet lines from Armenia to Artsakh go through the Berdzor corridor, which means you need to build the corresponding electrical systems, internet systems, and gas systems to go through the new bypass road, so that the Aliyev regime has absolutely no way of cutting people off in Artsakh from any of these services. Lastly, there are two villages south of Shushi, now that this road does not exist or is going to be handed over, that are going to have access problems to access the rest of the Artsakh Republic. What this shows us is, frankly, an incredible and negligent level of incompetence, which is almost unimaginable. This should all have been foreseen. This should have been all acted upon months or years before this moment. And frankly, this is the primary difference between having a third world state and a first world state, because third world states are capable of stamping your passport and telling you who owns what, but they have no planning capacity. What we're dealing with here is the capacities of a third world state, and that is what has put us in this situation. All of this should bring us to a lot of introspection and reflection about what brought us to this moment. Ultimately, if you, from a universal perspective, the faith that these people have to suffer over the next couple of weeks, which is to lose their homes that they've been living in for all these years, is a broken promise. It is a reflective of a broken promise by the Armenian state and the Armenian nation to these people. And they are angry about it, and they should have every right to be angry. But ultimately, who's responsible? And who is taking responsibility or not taking responsibility about the current situation? To get there, and to answer that question, I need to sort of give you a little bit of a story that sort of a roundabout way gets us there. On a weekly basis, I have multiple detractors, and one of them who is very active. He constantly sends me things that are whatever goes wrong in Armenia, which somehow I'm responsible for. And he did this last week after this announcement was made, essentially implying that I'm responsible for what is happening in these 3 villages and the fate that is befalling these wonderful people. And I started reflecting on it, and the more I thought about it, is that he is actually correct. I am responsible for what is happening in Berdzor. Obviously, not all of us are responsible on the same level, but you know, it's easy to blame the world, it's easy to blame other people, but we must all reflect on ourselves and understand what our faults are in this process. Now, what is my responsibility? You know, I moved here with my family 5 years ago. I could have moved here with my family 25 years ago. God knows what difference that could have made. Maybe it could have made a difference, or maybe it couldn't have made a difference, but we won't know that at this point. And lastly, I was in and out of Armenia for all those years, and I never yelled and screamed about corruption, about the lack of state building. So by not acting, I actually am responsible for this current moment. Not obviously the primary person, but I think what's important is for us to reflect upon ourselves and take responsibility for ourselves. So for my own failings, I take responsibility and I apologize. Now let's go over the partial or list of the responsible, or actually the irresponsible people that have brought us to this moment. Let's start with all the regimes that ruled Armenia from independence to the revolution. Can you really deny that you spent 27 years building a den of thieves? All the while knowingly allowing the army to be taken over and run by the corrupt and the incompetent. Then after all of that, you have the shamelessness to on street corners or in parliament and yell traitor all day long. And let me tell you what your biggest sin is, and that is you were so awful for so long that you've actually convinced a large part of this country into the mistaken assumption that you are actually the real enemy that we need to be worried about and not the genocidal regime in Baku. Let's move on to the current government. In 2 years, you've gone from foolish bravado to an equally foolish subservience in your dealings with the Aliyev regime. First and foremost, you failed to understand the world around us before the war started and the storms that were heading our way. You were incompetent in your decision-making after the war. And then after the war, you negotiated a ceasefire agreement that has enough landmines to create a political crisis or a military crisis every 6 months. Let's move on to our diaspora organizations. You have learned nothing over 100 years. What do your genocide recognition bills mean to the people that are being displaced in Berdzor? Does what happened to our ancestors need to be commented upon or affirmed by this idiot or that idiot in this parliament or that legislature? Instead of building a state in Armenia and institutions that can actually strengthen the state, you treated this country as Disneyland, coming and going without taking responsibility for it. Let's move on to the Artsakh government. No, you're not off the hook. You had 26 years to build Artsakh into an insurmountable fortress, and you obviously didn't do that where it really mattered. Instead, you built a state that was just as incompetent and corrupt as the one in Armenia. Let's move on to the Armenian church. We need to ask you a question. Are corruption, stealing, and lying sins or not? Because if they are, should we take your silence on these matters as consent or approval? Let's move on to everybody, large and small. I tell you who's responsible. Whoever accepted a bribe is responsible for our moment. Whoever paid a bribe is responsible for this moment. Whoever silenced truth tellers in any of our institutions is responsible for this moment. Whoever got rich without working for it is responsible for this moment. Whoever ever praised mediocrity is responsible for this moment. And most importantly, whoever did not demand excellence at all times is responsible for this moment. This is a time for self-reflection and taking responsibility, both individually and collectively. As painful as this process might be, it is actually the first step on the road to redemption. I will close with the following. Obviously, almost everything that I've outlined is quite negative, and it should be. But in truth, that is not all there is. We're actually living in this country in very complicated, complex times, not just here, but around the world. And in fact, in that world, and in our world, there's dramatically good things and dramatically bad things that can happen all at the same time. However, we should never be intimidated away from looking ourselves at the harshest light and essentially looking at reality in the mirror and not blinking. But at the same time, it does not mean we do not comprehend or appreciate the advantages that we have. And I can just tell you from a personal perspective, if you're ever lucky enough in this country to actually spend time with the best of the new generation that we have in this country, which I'm actually lucky enough to do, you will understand to a certain extent the hyperactivity of our enemies should be partially understood in these terms. In close, what explains my optimism in ending this very difficult and sad show, and that is from the knowledge that what the long arch of history tells us and teaches us is that free societies always in the long run triumph over slave ones. Always have, and they always will, and we're not going to be the exception to that rule. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
If I needed you, would you come to me? Would you come to me for to ease my pain? 'Cause if you needed me, I would come to you. I would swim the sea.